Now, okay, so let's get started, and a very warm welcome to what is today the 174th Security Thought Leadership webinar. And as you know, in these webinars, what we do is we take a topic and then we examine it from different angles. And the idea of thought leadership is to critique what's going on today in different ways so we get a better type of security tomorrow. And that takes many different forms and in many different ways. And today, we've got a webinar with a difference. In a minute, I'm going to introduce you to an ex-offender called Frank Portinari, who was involved in some very serious activities. And we're going to be hearing his side of the story. It's our chance to find out from someone involved in terrorism, the route into terrorism and perspectives on how one reflects on it. It started off in being involved with football, just a football fan. It developed into being a football hooligan. It developed into being extreme political membership, and then into terrorist activity. So it's with great pleasure today, I welcome the now non-militant, I should say, Frank Portinari. A very warm welcome.
Thank you, Martin. I appreciate that, and a nice introduction. Thank you.
Great to have you here. And Frank, so your journey is an incredible one, but let's start at the beginning of it all. There you were, a football fan. You hadn't been in trouble with the police before, and you started to get involved in football hooliganism. What was the attraction of that for you?
Well, I think I should explain that through the late 60s and early 70s, football was very much part of the culture that I was part of, whether that was playing football in the street or actually going to watch football matches, which was a bit more difficult because that obviously costs money, and there wasn't a lot of money around, for want of a better way of putting it. So we mainly played a lot of football. But eventually, when we found ways of making money locally as young men in our early teens, we then could afford to go to football matches and clearly see our heroes. I think the first time I went to an away game out of London, which was quite a dangerous thing to do in those days, I'd gone to Manchester and Tottenham was playing at Manchester City, and I went on my own because I could get a free ticket on the train because my stepfather was a lorry driver and he got tickets through British Rail. It wasn't a very clever thing to do. I was 14, probably weighed about 10 stone 7. I wasn't physically hurt, but I was surrounded, and it was only police intervention that prevented that happening. So I think that was my first introduction to football violence.
So what did you like about it, though? Because you quite liked the violence in the end, didn't you?
Well, eventually, because it's what went with the violence. It was the respect. It was showing your leadership skills, as I got older, not when I was 13, 14. It was also the lure of being in the company of older men. I didn't have any older brothers. I'd had 2 different fathers. So there wasn't a great deal of, how can I put it? It wasn't a great deal of guidance, if you like. So it wasn't as if I was getting taken fishing or some other interest. My sole engagement was with young men, and some very tough young men, and that took me to the football. And what happens is, particularly if you're at an away game and you become isolated, a small group of you, that's when a very quick decision has to be made. You either run or you stand and you fight. And probably when I was about 15, I would say, I didn't run. I stood. And of course, the following week at the home game, people recognise that. People recognise you and say, hello, mate, see you last week, wherever it was, and see that you stood. That's instant recognition. That's instant respect. So over the years, that grew. That reputation started to grow. And you then got pressure whereby if it was a Wednesday night and you had to go all the way to Newcastle from London, for example.
Which is about, what, 300 or 400 miles?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
and a very, up north, all very tough industrial towns and cities. If the right people didn't go, the majority of other people wouldn't go either. So it was almost a pressure on you. If I was going, and a group of others were going, then the rest would go. So you're getting that respect, you're getting that recognition. You don't necessarily realise it at the time, but on reflection, I can see that was the case.
Okay, Frank. And so from the world of sort of security and crime prevention point of view, eventually, as you say in your book, inevitably you got arrested.
Yes.
And you go to court.
Yeah.
You knew you were going to end up going to court eventually, and yet that didn't stop you. Nor, Frank, did the fact the court issued a penalty. You were fined or whatever. For some reason, the idea that once you get caught, you get punished, and it makes you think, didn't work with you.
No, quite the opposite, because it became a badge of honour. It was just further proof that you were somebody, that would stand up and be counted. So even when it came to on an occasion where I was arrested in Liverpool, I was already on a suspended sentence from an occasion where I'd been arrested when we played at Arsenal. So even though I was on a suspended sentence, and the judge was quite clear it was a custodial sentence, that didn't deter me from going to Liverpool and getting arrested again. And more luck than judgment, only because the police had written their statements the way people from Liverpool speak, which isn't the way you would speak in London, was enough for that to get thrown out of court. But that was more luck than judgment.
Yeah, absolutely. And you discussed that in your book. Okay, so you've now got a conviction, you're still involved in football hooliganism, and you get into extremism. You're suddenly attracted by that world, and you become politicized, and then you almost become radicalized as a result of that, Frank. How do you reflect on that? How do you reflect on the fact that you went from that process of just football hooliganism to the status that involves with that, into this extremism, and then into these terrorist sort of activities, which we'll come to in a minute? It's the radicalization process, Frank, I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think it's probably wise to explain that the first people coming to knock on my door who were political, because I certainly wasn't. As far as I was aware, blue was Conservative, red was Labour. I assumed my parents voted Labour because we were poor, working class, outside toilet, tin bath on a nail in the yard. I assumed that that's who they voted for. I never ever asked them. And one night people came and knocked on the door, and they were from the Young Socialists. And they were very idealistic, and they talked about,
quite left wing for those who are overseas, Frank. Just say that.
Sorry, I should expand. And they were very, wanted better housing, wanted, more jobs, wanted better health system, etc. And they seemed quite sincere. And I joined the Young Socialists. My friends, after a while, said, "Look, it's either the football or the politics," and I returned to the politics. And then, of course, somebody introduced me to right-wing politics, which I no more knew about. But what I would say was I was probably more nationalistic than international, for want of a better way of putting it. I wanted to solve the problems closer to home, as opposed to, I was less worried about what was going on in other countries, for want of a better way of putting it. Okay,
so how did you get from that to getting into what we'll talk about in a minute, some quite serious criminal activity, which ended up in prison, but I mean, slightly inevitably perhaps. But what was the route by which you started to get involved in the sort of crime world of this extremism?
Yeah. Well, that would have been, again, because being on marches, demonstrations, paper sales, election time, etc., there was always violence. So if you were me, once again, you got pushed up the front. You were somebody who could look after himself, and somebody who could, in a way, look after others as well. Politically, although I was being called an extremist, I didn't necessarily think I was being that extreme. I just thought I was speaking up for what I believed in at that time and what others did. In fact, if anything, most of the violence on the streets or even at meetings were aimed at us. So I actually saw myself as a defender. I was defending people's rights to have their view, and be able to meet and discuss it. So I didn't necessarily see myself as an extremist.
And if I'd have said to you, just go back to when you were at school, if I said to you, you were going to end up in prison for the sorts of activities that you ended up going to prison for, you know, supplying weapons for a terrorist group, would you have been surprised at that point, Frank, that you ended up there?
To be perfectly honest, for a boy that went to Sunday school and was brought up with, you know, with good morals, you know, I knew that there's no excuse. I knew the difference between right and wrong. No, I probably never, ever did. But there were times in my life when I'd be watching a film, a documentary or a drama, and it would come over me, the feeling that one day I would actually land up in prison.
Wow.
When it was the football, that was understandable. That was understandable that was always, you know, a likelihood in some respects. But no, I always had that feeling for some reason.
From your point of view, and I should just say, if you'd like to ask a question, do use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and incorporate that into the discussion. So you start to get involved in activities, Frank. Now you weren't alone in this. No. And I'm just wondering what happens when a group of you are involved in politics. That's one thing, and there are a lot of people doing that. To suddenly get involved in quite serious criminal activities. What's the journey? I mean, was there a leader in all this who was saying to you, come on, and you were following blindly or following willingly? Or were you the leader yourself, do you think?
No, I was the leader. There's no doubt in my mind about that. People have said to me, you've mentioned the word radicalization, you know, and people have said to me, I think they've tried to do it in a way to help me, to give me some kind of way out, for want of a better way of putting it, by saying, do you feel to some degree you were radicalised? And I've said, no, I take full responsibility. If anything, consciously or unconsciously, I was the one that was doing the radicalising, because friends followed it. So the same football people, some of the same football people, followed me to the right-wing politics, and in turn followed me to the loyalist politics. So I suspect there are quite a lot of people today that are quite pleased that I have actually, for want of a better way of putting it, you know, decided that this is the end of the line, so that they can equally say it's the end of the line. Otherwise, I suspect they'd still be following me, some of them.
But what was it about? What was it about you or about them, Frank, that on reflection meant that you led them and yourself into these quite extreme forms of behaviour?
But I think it's partly built upon the fact that I'm not very patient of bar stool preachers, and I'm not sure how many of your audience would understand what I mean by that. I'm talking about people that sit in pubs on a bar stool and try to put the world to right. And I still know those people 40 years later, and they've done absolutely nothing about any of the complaints that they've got. That isn't me. I am the one that jumps off the bar stool and says, right, come on, what are we doing? And how are we going to go about it?
Yeah, because that comes through in your book. You take full responsibility, and you explain quite clearly, Frank, that you were a leader in this, right? That you were at the forefront saying, come on, chaps, let's go forward. But here's the thing. I'm pretty convinced that had I been part of your group, that wouldn't have appealed to me. And I wonder if there's something about them too, that they were following you all the way through. And what were they looking for? I mean, what was the process by which they wanted to continue? Because they were pretty damn loyal, weren't they?
Yes, and not only that, I think what people need to understand, this wasn't confined to London. Although I was in charge of what was going on in London, I travelled the country extensively, certainly England. I mean, I did go to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. I travelled quite extensively, and I actually called out people who were using certain titles but weren't actually carrying out any activity. So I went and forged new friendships with people who I believed would be militant, because the rest were no good to me. I was militant. I wanted to be militant, and I wanted to surround myself with people who would equally be militant. So as I say, it wasn't confined to just London.
Okay, so let's get some questions from the audience. Try and get a bit of audience participation here. And Simon Cham asked this question. Frank, with the benefit of hindsight, what could society have done to change the sequence of events which led to this radicalization process you've discussed? He's interested in what you said. What could society have done to have changed that? Do you, if anything, do you think?
I think that would have to go back to my school days. I think that very much would have to go back to my school days. I'm informed that I wasn't a stupid kid. I mean, I've got no qualifications, but that's on the basis I never sat any exams. So in 1972, you could still leave when you were 15. I had actually left school when I was 14 and was working. My parents didn't even know I was working. But the idea of leaving school was because we had so little. And I'm not exaggerating when I said at periods of secondary school, I was going to school with holes in my shoes. So it made sense to me, in order to be independent and clothe myself, it meant leaving school. And I was less of a strain on my parents. So, yeah, I think that would be the point. I think if I'd have stayed on at school, I think if I'd have studied the subjects I wanted to study, which is mainly what I think would have been English, that my career prospects may have been different. I may have been just as extreme in my career as what I've been in other areas of my life.
Yeah, I mean, do you regret it now, Frank? Do you regret what you did?
Not particularly, if I'm honest. I have to be brutally honest about that, because I think people need to understand that there are probably a lot of other people like me out there as well. My biggest regret, I mean, I've recently spoke in Dublin. 2 weeks ago, I was in Dublin at a professional speakers global summit, and I sat on stage with a lady whose father was blown up by the IRA, a lady called Jo Berry. Her father was Sir Anthony Berry. She'd been working for 20 years with the man who blew her father up, Patrick McGee. We sat on the stage and we had a conversation. And when I was asked that question, my biggest regret, the irony is that the people that I hurt the most were my own family, because I left them, with no security. They eventually, they lost their home. I obviously lost the job. We lost the car. We had to cash in insurance things and so on. That's my biggest regret. Not out of any, how can I put this, concern for myself, just purely for my family.
Just to say, for those of you not familiar, that of course sharing a platform with that sort of group would have been the enemies in the past, and here you are sharing a platform talking about these issues in a modern light. Let me go to more questions then. I mean, Ayushi Maheta says, if you could go back in time and change one thing about your journey, would it be the schooling, or were there other things along the way? Do you think, and I think where I just want to pick up on what you've just said, Frank, you mentioned school, understand that. But you also mentioned this almost addiction, is it to violence, or this almost addiction to the excitement that goes with violence? I mean, have you got any idea what that was about?
I don't want people to get the impression it was some kind of bloodlust. I can imagine some sociologist sitting there and saying, well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? He couldn't get enough violence at the football. He thought he'd be getting involved with street politics, and then he would make the transition, to the paramilitary world. It wasn't like that, I can assure you. Not on my part, anyway. I could understand if people said, took that view. I think what opened my eyes was when I wrote the book, because I didn't write the book for me. I wrote the book for other people that said that if I'd got run over by a bus, 30 years of their history, political and social history, would be lost. So I thought I took that on as a responsibility then. So after writing the book, I then read the book, and you then suddenly say to yourself, how did I get here? You suddenly realise it's not a stranger you're reading about, it's you. And that's where I identified, where I clearly had this thing in me that I will go to extremes. If you employ me, I would make a great employee, because you always get more out of me. I said, if I had joined a church tomorrow. You invited me to your church tomorrow. Give it a few weeks, I would be up in the pulpit. Probably somewhere down the line, I'd start my own church. It's something I've recognised. It's something I definitely know about me.
Because, I mean, Charlie Swanson has argued, would anything have sort of deterred you following that path? You've mentioned school, but of course, Frank, would you say that if you'd have come out of schooling and young life with a trade or with the education that would have enabled you to do something different, that you would never have, it's very much less likely you'd have got involved in these activities, or you wouldn't? I mean, would you put it that strong?
Yes, I believe if I'd have continued with education and enjoyed that, and had a clear idea of what I wanted to do when I left school, which I didn't, in all fairness, I think that would have definitely changed the circumstances. I'd have just probably been over enthusiastic in whatever it is I was going to do, or I could have done.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing is, so after you started to get into hooliganism, you get into extremism. Was there Dennis Shep from Canada, who's been a panelist before, Frank, saying, was there a mentor? Was there someone guiding you and influencing you and pushing you on in order to carry you forward through all these things?
No. If anything, that was me doing that myself. That was almost like me calling out other people. But you're moaning about it. You're complaining about it. You're making observations about it. What are you doing about it? And when it was clear that they weren't, that's where I stepped in. So I liken it to this. When I do talks occasionally, I liken it to this. I call it the treadmill. You get on the treadmill, you press the green button and you go forward. You don't look to the left and you don't look to the right and you don't look behind you. And one day you press the red button and you get off, and then you look around you and then you say, how on earth did I get here? And then you question, why did I get on the treadmill? Who helped me to get on the treadmill? Why didn't other people get on the treadmill? You know, there were no safety mechanisms in place. It was just go forward. And again, I recognise that now.
Yeah, I mean, and the question is, could anything have got you off that treadmill? I mean, clearly the police didn't bother you too much. Clearly getting caught wasn't an overriding concern. It was always a possibility, but you kept going. The threat of prison didn't seem to deter you too much. Is there any other angle you can think of that would have made you think, hold on a minute, this is not the best thing? Could we have had a chat, Frank, with the right sort of alternative way of explaining this?
I think the only person that springs to mind is my own wife. We'd met when I was 15. So this year we've been together for 50 years. Now, probably again, reflecting on it in a warped kind of way. When I was going to fight at football matches, I probably thought I was impressing her. A lot of my mates probably thought they were impressing their girlfriends. We probably didn't realise they were calling us idiots. You know, when that progresses and you get older and you get more responsibility, it's quite possible that again, you're going to places and people are welcoming you, they're shaking your hand, they're patting you on the back, they're buying you drinks. You know, I probably thought, wow, she's probably impressed by all this. You know, I'm a leader. So I don't deny there was a certain amount of kudos involved as well.
And this is what others say, Frank. I mean, one of the points about being in the world of crime is there is kudos attached to it amongst peer groups, and it becomes a driver. We've had other people saying a similar thing. Frank, can I just take you to the next stage of this? So you started to get involved in supplying, for example, weapons to terrorist group and terrorists. Did you ever stop to think, goodness me, this is going to result in people dying, maybe innocent people dying? This is very, very serious stuff. Was that a process that you went through at all?
I think if you believe that those weapons are going to be used to, it sounds quite brutal, I appreciate that, to eliminate the people that are killing other people, you know, your community, for want of a better way of putting it. you can kind of live with that. I say to people now that I haven't actually killed anybody. Has there ever been intent? Then yes, I have to be honest. Yes, there was intent. You're not in charge of an organisation, and you and got guns on, weapons wrapped around you, and not have intentions of using them. So I'm quite open about that. Now I say this: I can be slightly blasé in the sense that I don't know if any of the weapons that I provided actually killed anybody. Now, if the police came to me today with modern forensics and said, we've identified this weapon, it came from you, it was used to shoot an innocent Catholic. His mother died of a heart attack 6 months later. His wife had a nervous breakdown, and all his children have had behavioural problems since. I'm not going to feel very much of a soldier, am I? That is not going to make me feel good at all. And I'm not sure how I would feel if I had actually taken somebody's life, because I've not been in that position.
But did someone have that dialogue with you? As you're reflecting now, Frank, it's almost, could the older Frank talking to the younger Frank have opened your eyes to that possibility? And if so, could that have made a difference at any point in any way?
No, I don't think it would have, because it became so tit for tat. And once associates get killed, once people go to prison, once you sit on a prison bus with women and their children, and the mothers have tried to make themselves look nice for their husbands, and the children have got their best clothes on. It's all a front on the way into the prison. When you're on that bus on the way back, and the women are crying and the children are crying and so on, you suddenly feel very protective. You start to feel very protective of those people. You start to think about when they get off the minibus and they go through the front door of their house, who looks after them then? Who cares about them then? It becomes very, very personal. And I clearly felt of myself as a defender of those people. So the people threatening them were my enemy. And then it gets worse, because what happens then, you become less discerning about who your enemy is. That's the problem. So you suddenly can start to legitimise doing things you would never have dreamt of doing before.
And this is the treadmill that you explain. You're just getting further and further into it. Okay, so you start to get involved with these, and you start to attract the attention of the police.
Yes.
Quite logically, and the intelligence services, and they make it clear they're onto you, Frank. So you know they're following you, and they're stopping you, and they're talking to you. Now then, this is serious stuff, and they know they're onto you. Did they ever say to you, right, you better give this up, or else you're in serious trouble and you'll be going to prison for a long time? Did they ever say that to you? Did they ever give you the chance to pull out?
Yeah, and it wasn't even special branch, because I was quite used to the special branch. It was actually military intelligence, and they actually had me sitting in the back of the car, and they told me chapter and verse something that I'd taken part in a couple of weeks previous, and I mean everything from the start of the day to the end of the day, and I sat there and basically said to them, "Well, nick me then, arrest me then," because my attitude was one of, well, if you were going to, I wouldn't be sitting in the back of the car, would I? I'd be sitting in a police station or a detention centre somewhere. So again, that was the blaséness creeping in again. I'm sitting in the back of a car. I'll worry about it when you take me somewhere else, or you put the handcuffs on me. But they did tell me, I was shocked. And the term they used was, "Frank, we'll give you enough rope and you'll hang yourself." And clearly a couple of years later, I did.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions from you and Grant is looking at things from your side of the fence. What were your impressions of the police investigations into the arms supplying? He's saying he's never been entirely convinced that mainland forces fully understand how to tackle this. Was that your impression, Frank, that they weren't on the ball?
I think my experience is one of you. I think they can only act on information received. You know, I appreciate there's only a certain budget, so they can't follow you every day of the week. If someone's flying over from Belfast or Londonderry and it flags up, then I know that weekend I'm going to get followed. I know that resources will be provided to, and it happened on many occasions. You know, it got to the stage where I was counting the vehicles involved over a 3 or 4 day period. So resources could be found, but I suspect only when they felt that there was a real need for it. And I think in some cases it was a deterrent. It was as if to say, look, we know such and such is here. We know he's in your company. He's going to be questioned on the way back, you know. So, yeah, I mean, what struck me was when there was in London where the Islamic terrorists left Luton and they travelled to King's Cross and Russell Square, etc. I remember sitting there with my wife and saying, once again, there seems to be a situation where one agency isn't talking to another agency and they're not sharing their information. As they clearly didn't in my case. They didn't share the information because I suspect I'd have got arrested a lot sooner.
Okay, interesting itself, Frank. And of course, eventually you did get arrested. You're taken to court. You're sent to prison.
Yeah.
Now, when you got to prison, Frank, were you now thinking, "Oh my word, this is I should never have got involved in that. That was a disaster. I'm going to stop this immediately. I get out."
No, if anything, it reinforced it. Because again, it goes back to that badge of honour. You know, I didn't go into prison as a criminal in my head. I went into prison as a loyalist prisoner. Now, if you'd have moved in the circles that I'd moved in, that was very much a badge of honour. There is a great deal of camaraderie between that. You can be sitting in a room in company and there'd be another loyalist prisoner there. You won't have to explain each other's story to each other. You've got an instant bond. You know what that feels like. So to go into prison as a loyalist prisoner, to me was a badge of honour. You know, it said who I was. It said what I'd been prepared to do. So no, prison didn't put me off at all. What I did have to learn very quickly in prison was you can't think you're special. You can't say to people, "I'm not a criminal. I'm a loyalist prisoner." No, you're a criminal. You broke the law. You know, and I had to learn to adapt to that quite quickly.
And did you find it tough to adapt to prison? Because was this your first time? This was your first time?
First time. Yeah, I was probably in my late 30s.
Yeah. Okay. So it wasn't as if you'd been through the normal route to prison, which is shop theft and then car stealing. This was straight ahead. So you clearly weren't weren't too worried about going to prison, though, Frank. I mean, did you feel as though you coped with prison well?
I used the same leadership skills that I knew that I had. I very quickly ingratiated myself into prison life. I didn't smoke, so therefore I used my quantity of tobacco to sell, to make profit. And then I'd have phone cards, I'd have cash. I was brewing hooch, illegal alcohol, basically. I sold jewellery. I did anything that people would come to me was also a bit of a safety mechanism, because you don't rob him because he's the supplier. The one thing I wouldn't do is drugs. And I think that's why the prison officers kind of gave me a certain amount of leeway. I was also a great peacemaker, when there was trouble between people that owed each other things. So I definitely had a role to play. And I think the prison service used that quite well. I think they were quite clever. They knew I was no threat. I was never going to cause any violence towards any prison staff. They knew I'd taken advantage of the prison education system. I passed lots of qualifications in the industrial cleaning class and became an assessor. In fact, I was teaching other inmates eventually.
So here's the thing then, Frank. So given that, when you came out, why were you not committed to giving up at that point this militant activity, criminal activity? Why did prison not work?
Because nobody ever tried to rehabilitate me. Not in what I think the traditional sense that people would understand that to mean. I can understand why I got parole. I'd taken education classes. I'd never been in any trouble. I got baptised in church. That was of my own volition. I wanted to do that. I think I was probably a model prisoner. I think they realised I wanted to get back with my family. They realised I wanted to get back into society and work. But what they never ever did was actually discuss what I was in there for in the first place.
And yet,
I beg your pardon, sorry to interrupt. The only person that did was actually a chap called the Reverend Roger Green, because I used to go to his chaplain discussions group. And one evening we had some outside people come in and talk with us. And the next day he came to my cell and said, "You seem to get on very well with Mick last night," one of the outreach people. And I said, "Yeah, he's a really nice chap." He said, "Well, what if I'd have told you that he was actually an ex-IRA man?" And I was brutally honest, and I said I'd probably punched him. So it just goes to show, if he didn't wear a badge and I didn't wear a badge, and we sat there and spoke together, we got on perfectly fine.
Yeah, interesting. And here's the thing then, Frank. So you did mention earlier on, and you've mentioned you've been with your wife 50 years. She was with you through all of this.
Yes.
You've mentioned the fact about family. There wasn't a sense in which you felt that for your family you ought to give all this up, and as you said yourself, they suffered. Was that not pull enough?
No, because it became part of our lives. Unfortunately, it became part of our day-to-day lives. I can remember a time when I first went to prison that my mother basically said to my wife, "I blame you for this. You could have stopped this." Now, if my wife had stopped me from doing anything, my mother would have been the first person to say, "You can't tell him what to do." So my wife was in a very awkward position. And I think she probably didn't realise how serious it was. I honestly believe she thought it was no different from the football or the right-wing stuff. There was an element of risk, so to speak. I think a lot of times I went to Glasgow and Londonderry and Belfast, she probably saw it as a bit of a jolly up for the boys, I don't think she really understood the seriousness of it.
And the thing is, Frank, one of the things you said when we were talking about this webinar in advance, when your wife first came to see you in prison, you said to her, "I'm pleased I got caught." Yeah. And why was it? Why in the end were you pleased you got caught?
Because I knew where it was going to end. It was the first open visit we had. It was still away from the main prison population, but it wasn't behind a screen. We were actually across the table. And I leant across and basically said, "I'm glad I got caught." And she said, "What do you mean? How could you possibly want to be caught?" And I said, "Where did you think this was going to end?" And as I said to you earlier, if you're in charge, if you've got yourself into this position where you've got rid of everybody else that isn't militant and surrounded yourself with people that are, and you've got access to weapons, it was only going to lead one way. And she basically said to me, "Are you telling me you'd have killed somebody?" And I don't think I ever answered her. I think I just kind of shrugged my shoulders at the go, "Well, yeah." And I was genuinely pleased because I did know where it was going to end.
And so why did you give up in the end, Frank? Why have you given up?
I've given up in the sense that I've realised I wish I'd taken a more political approach.
And you mean a non-violent approach?
Yeah.
Non-criminal.
And I learnt that much later, after the peace, or during the peace process, where I was still visiting interface areas where there was still some conflict going on, and realised I could help people in those communities without resorting to violence. What was the point of me going the other side of the peace line and shooting somebody else? That wasn't going to solve their problem. So I started to learn, and we started to organise football tournaments. We started to, hold events here in England to benefit people there. And I suppose I kind of took on the role of like a community worker. And eventually that was recognised. And on the 18th of May, 2011, I was actually invited to Dublin with a group of former combatants, and that was the state visit of Her Majesty the Queen. And that was
And the
what
thing
I
is,
said, recognition.
we see, here's an interesting thing. So you've made that transition, and the fact you're even here talking about it, Frank, is indicative of the fact you've made that transition. Michael White wants to know: were there people trying to pull you back, though? Were you having to face that resistance?
No, and funny enough, what someone else once asked me as well: did I not ever think that I might be a victim one day? And that is definitely the treadmill scenario. I was so busy focusing on other people, targeting other people. I didn't even take into account, hold on, what if people are doing the same? What if they're observing me? What if they're trying to harm me? What if they're trying to harm my family? And that's the blinkers. That's having having blinkers. So no, I can appreciate people may have thought that, there's a road and there's turn-offs and so on. But in my case, it was just go forward.
Frank, interesting. And so what are you doing now? How are you earning your living now, Frank? Because you're currently writing a follow-up, but you've written one book, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We'll let people know how they can get hold of it. You're writing another book. And what else are you doing with your life?
The second book is far more reflective because I've had conversations like this and I've had time to observe myself and listen to myself.
And what's the purpose of the second book, Frank? Why are you writing that one?
It is that because I want people to see that there can be a transition, that you can, and maybe don't go as far as me, in the future. I'll say to young people now when I talk to them, you've got far more in common than what you've got. And there is a saying by who was a prominent loyalist paramilitary, but also a politician, a man called John McMichael. And his words were basically, nobody was exclusively right and nobody was exclusively wrong. And if we can meet in the middle and start a conversation from there, that's what I do. And I do give talks. I'm a member of the Professional Speaking Association. And that's some of the conversations that I have. I was doing not a website, I was doing a podcast for a while called Frankly Speaking with Frank Portinari. That's people who don't always get access to, the public. And I spoke to very, the criteria to come on was it had to be inspiring. They had to be real and inspiring people. And it crossed a whole group of different people. And
you're now started. You're just about to start a new initiative all of your own, partly linked to crime.
Yes, I was doing some of that. I was doing a talk on a bus, and someone said to me, "Why don't you do your own tour?" And I live in Camden. I've always lived in the London Borough of Camden, and it's very famous for its markets, music venues, the Camden Lock. It's street food, street art. But what no one's ever done is spoken about the dark side of Camden. And that got me thinking I could do a walk-in tour. So it is called The Dark Side of Camden. It covers serial killers, serial rapists, gangsters, witchcraft, terrorism, ironically. And that started to appeal to corporate audiences because it's good for team building and entertaining their clients. And tourists. So that's my new extremism, for want of a better way of putting it, Martin. That's what I'm focused on.
Well, Frank, listen, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I mean, it's a fascinating experience. People can get hold of your book, which we'll send out notes with this, Frank, so they know where to get it. They can go on your tour of Camden. When do they start, Frank? When does that start, the tours?
The first corporate one is actually next Wednesday. And the first tourist ones are from the first Saturday in November.
And how do people find out about those?
There is a website
called
www.thedarksideofcamden.uk.
Frank, thank you very much indeed. Really, really appreciate it. Absolutely fascinating to speak to you, Frank Portinari. And, that's what happens when you get a chance to speak to people who've been through a very different type of experience. And we'll be returning to that theme in future webinars as well. Just a couple more final points from me, if I might. Just to say that up and coming events, you've got the Australian Security Industry Awards next Wednesday. I fly to Australia on Sunday for the OSPAs, Australian Security Industry Awards next Wednesday night. So if you're in Sydney, come to those. Hack Economic Crime Awards are in November. Canadian Oscars, 24th of November, virtual awards ceremony. Look out for it, 24th of November. 15th of December, the Cyber Oscars are taking place. And 23rd of February, the UK Oscars are taking place. They're taking place all over in the world. We're back again on a webinars on the 27th of October, when the topic is body-worn cameras, essential security or an invasion of privacy. Very much looking forward to our panel for that one. So once again, thank you very much indeed to you, the audience. Thank you very much indeed to Frank for his frank and candid response to questions. A lot we can learn from that. And wherever you are in the world, until we meet again, stay safe.